Hi, scholars. So today we're going to talk about two readings. The mission of Wounded Knee activists continues 50 years later with the children and grandchildren, and we're going to talk about, so what is blood quantum? The blood quantum lecture will be very, very short. I just want to give you a framework to think about as you are reading. So the mission to Wounded Knee is where we're going to start. This is written by Mackenzie Hoover. She's a journalist, a freelance reporter. She got her BA for journalism and political science from South Dakota State University. And in this article, she's asking us to think about the continued mission of activism, the kind of generational legacy of activism for the Lakota people, looking specifically at Wounded Knee. And the article is pretty straightforward. You can use those guided key terms and questions, but there's a couple of things that I wanted to make sure that you were clear on before you got too far into the reading. Wounded Knee, the 1973 protest and occupation was a 71-day occupation at Wounded Knee. And it was about the sustained discrimination and violence that Indigenous people suffered at the hands of the U.S. government. It's also more specifically about the violent massacre that happened on December 29th, 1890, when U.S. Army killed 150 Lakota people, primarily women and children. So the 1971 occupation protest that began on February 27th of 1973 was symbolic and a tribute to the lives lost in that massacre and the movements for Indigenous life and sovereignty that followed. They called for everything from control of reservation lands and mineral rights to restoration of ancient tribal customs to the power of specific curriculum in Indian grade schools. It was both this symbol and a hearkening to the lives lost in the 1890s. But in 1973, they were still also fighting for their continued needs, their contemporary issues. And so they asked for those three things. The article is asking you to have some baseline knowledge about Wounded Knee and the activism and the events, the history of Wounded Knee. And it's asking you to consider how the children and grandchildren are moving forward with their activism. And so I think these quotes here are important. So Banks Rama's father, Dennis Banks, says, "It was my generation's job to go and beat the doors down to fight our way into these institutions and to have Native people be heard and recognized." He's talking about those issues, the activism in the 60s and 70s, when they are fighting to get their issues and concerns illuminated in part of public discourse. He's talking about that history of activism that includes occupying Alcatraz, or that includes the long walk across the country to highlight and illuminate the concerns of Indigenous people. He goes on to say it's your generation and the next generation's job to walk into those institutions that they've already opened the doors to, right? And work them from the inside with the same mission. There is a longstanding belief that once the institutions have been, the doors have been opened, however forcefully by protests, it's the next generation's responsibility to then go into those institutions, work from the inside to change them so that they are more equitable in their function. The next quote reads, "Liberation, freedom. That's always been our collective vision as a nation, to reclaim the sovereignty prior to colonization and to get as close as possible to being the spiritual beings and to have a way of life that we've always carried. It's still there now because we fought so hard to keep it." So if you think about the pre-colonial videos that you looked at, the Native America and their connection to both nature and science, to the land and to the people and to learning, you know that they had a fully formed concept of who they are. Being a part of the colonized group, The power group, the colonizer, tends to create a narrative of lack in order to justify its violence. So the liberation and freedom is also about creating and sustaining your own narrative to reclaiming who you are and what you know yourself to be outside of the discourse that the colonizer creates for you. I wanted you to have those framings first. And then one of the things that she writes about is grassroots activism. Grassroots activism and organizing is what's called a bottom-up strategy. It constructs its organizing with the leadership of the people most effective, centering their particular needs and desires. It is leadership by the community for the community. People are the decision makers. The folks in the community are the decision makers. Most of the time, we learn about activism and we learn about usually formally educated folks who come in to a particular community. They look in, they decide what needs to be taken care of, and then they organize around their assessment, not necessarily communicating with the members in the community. Most of the time, a charismatic leaders or authoritative or organizations don't consider the people and as contributors to the movement. They often see themselves kind of paternalistic as someone or something that knows the best, knows what's going to be needed. That's not a bottom up strategy. That's a top down strategy. When the leadership is by the community and for the community, the people are the decision makers. It entrusts them to know who they are and what they need and the priority for which they need it. So I'll give you an example. So you may go into a community and you see that all of the buildings are in shambles, right? And that needs to be addressed. So you and your organization go in and you're like, we need to address these buildings. These buildings are in shambles. We need to make sure that we cover the windows. We need to make sure that we get some repair going on here. But when you talk to the community people, someone who talks to the community people and says what you need, the community members may say, you know, right now our primary concern, we understand that all of this is in shambles, but our primary concern right now is accessible food. That's the thing that we need to address first, right? So if you go in in a top-down situation, you go in and you're just going to take on your assessment what needs to be done. You're not necessarily putting the people in the community in a better situation. When you're doing grassroots organizing, the figurehead, the authoritative figures don't exist. The community works as a collective, and that's what the organizations that she highlights in this piece are working for. They're working for a community-driven organizing effort. So the first one is Women of All Red Nations are Worn. They had their first conference in 1972, and that's when they were first organized. Their goals were to, one, rejuvenate a struggling movement and create new and previously unexplored opportunities for activism, to fulfill the leadership vacuum created by the FBI's interference with the American Indian Movement, or AIM, and to continue the movement's progress, to formalize the roles of women within the movement, and to provide an outlet for women who wanted to be agents of change. So women have always been quite active in organizing efforts, but because we live in a society that focuses more on patriarchy, oftentimes the women of movements are silenced. And so their effort is to ensure that their voices and their efforts are recognized as agents of change. The Black Hills Alliance began organizing in the 1970s in an effort to protect and serve the environment of the Black Hills, which is in South Dakota and the surrounding communities. The NDN Collective is an Indigenous-led organization dedicated to building Indigenous power through organizing, activism, philanthropy, grant making, capacity building, and narrative change. They are creating sustainable solutions on Indigenous terms. Their mission is to build collective power of Indigenous people, community, and nations to exercise their inherent right to self-determination while fostering a world that is built on a foundation of justice and equity for all people and Mother Earth. The 3 Ds of their organization are defend, develop, and decolonize. When you hear the term self-determination, you're going to hear that several times in the next few weeks as we work through some social justice movements from different groups of people. Self-determination, liberation, and freedom are all about being able to exist and govern yourself. And for most of these organizations, it's with a sense of equity among all people, not creating these hierarchical systems that position one group over the other. For most of these places, self-determination relies on community building and community efforts. And then finally, we have the Thunderhill Community Development is an organization and a corporation that works for the liberation of Lakota people. They do their work through 8 interconnected incentive areas that are rooted in lifeways and wellness equity work. They work as a whole community. Their approach is the grassroots community approach to serve the Lakota community. And the Turtle Island area is an important example for how they work in their efforts. Okay, so those are the things that I wanted you to, that aren't fully explained. I've included the website links to most of the organizations. The Women of All Reds Nation doesn't have its own website, or at least not one that I could find. The information that I pulled came from those websites. So if you're interested in learning more, you can use those web links. And then I want to show you a little video. This is footage of the Dakota Access Pipeline protest. The Dakota Access Pipeline route is through 4 states, North Dakota and South Dakota, Iowa, and Illinois. It crosses the Missouri River. It crosses into indigenous lands. It crosses into lands that are supposed to be protected through the treaties. And so the Sioux in 2016, in 2017, were very active in protesting and challenging through public demonstration the disruption of protected lands and reserves. They had more than 6 months of legal battles. At one point, the Obama administration put a stay on the construction of the pipeline in order to try to figure out alternative routes. That was towards the end of the Obama administration. The Trump administration reversed that decision and allowed the pipeline to go through. The indigenous people had lost all of their court cases. And so in March of 2017 was the official decision that ended their movement. And so the production of the pipeline, and I'm assuming that it's been fully constructed at this point. I'm not sure. I haven't looked into it, but I wanted you to see these protest footage. So let's see if this plays.
If it wasn't for Facebook or social media, then nobody would know about our story. Morning, relatives.
On November 2nd, Sempuali 20 went live on Facebook to urge participation in a prayerful river action.
Everybody's good though. Everybody's in prayer though. We got a couple actions going on. One by the bridge, one by the river.
So that he and fellow Standing Rock activists could cross a creek to reach sacred native land.
You feel it. You feel the tension.
What are you doing? Your water is under attack!
Stand up, fight back!
We're here to pray. We're just here to pray.
This land is where the Dakota Access Pipeline is being built.
It's scary because to shoot rubber bullets at these people that are completely unarmed when they took an oath to protect them.
Police used pepper spray and rubber bullets to disperse them.
You got hit? Josh!
Oh my God. Did this guy you?
Get a medic!
Get a medic!
Get a medic!
Police were given authority to arrest those who crossed the creek for trespassing.
We have to use our phones to just show our side of our story.
Put your weapons down!
Social media has been a good tool for us to provide the right information and communication with the outside world. We're able to connect with thousands of people instantly. What happened on October 27th was a big day for me just because that was the day they took over the frontline camp. It was hard to even witness it, but the world needed to see what was going on.
Law enforcement forcibly removed Native Americans and allies from their encampment on the pipeline's construction site.
They went in there and they beat up a lot of relatives. We had grandmothers there. They shoved their grandmothers around. They dragged their grandmothers around.
More than 200,000 people have watched Isha Hofer's live video from October 27th.
We have our cameras and our prayers. That's all we have.
It is because of social media that this movement has grown.
Native people from hundreds of tribes have vowed to continue their movement and to tell its story on their own terms.
I was raised with the stories that we are the stewards of this land. So we have to protect the water like our ancestors did. We have to protect the land like our ancestors did.
I'm here for my kids, my grandkids, because I want to make sure that everybody's children's safe, everybody has a chance to drink clean water in their lifetime.
I hope only for peace that we're able to come to an agreement to stop this pipeline.
This is not just a Native issue. This is an American issue, and Americans should be aware that this is happening.
Okay, so I wanted you all to see that footage, just so that you had an idea of what's happening today. The kind of things, environmental concerns have always been a part of Native activism. Sovereignty and land rights have been a part of Native activism. Protecting sacred lands have been a part of Native activism. Being able to determine who they are, define themselves without U.S. government interference has been a part of Native activism. So I wanted you to have some understanding of those things as you read that article. Okay. And then, so what exactly is blood quantum? Is written by Kat Choi. She's a journalist and a writer who is working on a project about people who are learning and relearning their heritage language. Language is also very important to Indigenous peoples. And so she's writing about this phenomenon called blood quantum, which, as you will read in the article, is initiated by the U.S. government as a metrics for measuring how much Indianness or nativeness exists in a particular person. And there's some limitations, some issues with it that are outlined in the piece. And there's some benefits to it as outlined in the piece. It's no longer used in the same ways by the U.S. government, but it is still a practice by many Indigenous nations. But what I want you to be aware of is blood quantum and the one drop rule were both effectively used by governing structures. So remember, when we're talking about the making of the nation and the making of race and the social construct of race, much of these constructs have been a part of government and public policy that impacts people's lives. So these aren't just arbitrary, oh, okay, you're 1/4 Native. That meant that you had access or lack of access to certain things. The one drop rule for Black people, which suggested that if you had even one drop of Black blood in you, then that made you Black. Meant that you did not have access to certain things. You could not access citizenship claims. You could not access purchasing land. You could not access voting rights, right? So these things aren't arbitrary. They are a part of creating both inclusion and exclusion from different groups, right? It ensured that Black people, the one drop rule ensured that Black people who were Indigenous could not access any of the benefits that Indigenous people were able to access during that period of time. So I want you to understand these things and think about them in the context of race being socially constructed, and that race is in large part built in and through our legal system, right? So I want you to think about that as you're reading through this article. The rest of it is pretty straightforward, but if you have any questions about any of these two articles, please let me know, and I will be glad to answer them for you. Have a very good day, and I will talk to you in the next video.